So Connor, to start, most people probably don't know you unless they're a big paranormal fan.
Yeah.
So could you give us like a rundown of who you are, and a little bit of your paranormal ghost hunting resume?
Mm-hmm. My name is Connor Randall. I am a paranormal investigator based out of the Denver area here. I've been fascinated with the strange and the unknown for as long as I can remember. Growing up, having a couple of ghostly experiences as a child sort of drove me to search for more answers, and it just sort of opened up the gateways to all of these sorts of strange things. And so I'm able to sort of combine my passions for the unexplained along with filmmaking and just sort of being as much of a investigative journalist as I can in this modern day and age. And so, have since worked on projects and appeared on shows like way back in the day, Ghost Adventures, did some work with the local TAPS team here in Colorado from Ghost Hunters, and got to sort of learn a lot from those guys in the paranormal world, ghost-wise, and then sort of branched into aliens and the strange and the unknown, and started going off on UFO hunts on my own, and then met with my friend Carl Pfeiffer, and we went out recently a couple of years ago and created a project about goblins in Kentucky, in caves, and this whole big paranormal mystery called Hellier that's on Amazon Prime and YouTube, and since we're just sort of non-stop making these documentaries and documenting odd things.
Okay, so we're here to talk about Roswell.
Yeah.
Can you summarize the events of what happened near Roswell, New Mexico in the 1940s as you understand?
In late June, early July of 1947, a young ranch hand named Mac Brazel woke up one morning, was checking the fields, and discovered a significant debris field alongside one of the areas that the ranch that he helped operate was on, and saw this sort of strewn out, what looked like metallic looking structures, and clearly a major accident had occurred. He looked a little bit closer and gathered up some of the debris and material. Some people argue whether or not he saw bodies. That story changes. Gathered up the material and took it into town. Now, his ranch was actually about 85 miles northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. It was actually closer to a town, I want to say 25 miles, called Corona, New Mexico, a much smaller town. And he took that material into town a couple of days later, because he's a ranch hand. He's got a lot to handle. And remember, this is 1947. And this is an old rickety truck, and we're talking, a 4+ hour drive. So he had to set aside time for this. Took some of the material from that field, the debris field laying out on his land, into town. And the first person that he walks up to in Roswell, New Mexico, which is a mid-sized town, small by today's standards for sure, but it was a military town, and had, a fair population, but a small town for sure by today's standards. Brought it actually to the town sheriff, first of all. The sheriff is a guy named Wilcox, and he sees this and immediately says, we should probably talk to the Army or the Air Force about this. Takes the debris from the sheriff's office and shows it to the military. One of the other points in question, again, because the story initially gets kind of confuddled, is whether or not they talked to the town DJ. Because the town DJ claims that he talked to them in between that, and he got a hold of the material and saw stuff before the military did. And so that point's up for debate still, but regardless, military ends up finding out about it, and the Roswell Army Airfield is the person who oversees this project is a man named Colonel Blanchard. And Colonel Blanchard looks at this, seems to have somewhat of an idea of what might be going on, but is totally unsure, sends one of his trusted deputies, a man named Major Jesse Marcel, out there back with Mac to get back out to the debris field and sort of examine and see what happens. Jesse goes out to the debris field, looks at all of this, gathers up more material, puts it in his truck, and then takes it back into Roswell. And after that happens is sort of when all hell breaks loose. He takes it back, and as he does this, the military sort of starts to seemingly sort of freak out, sending large amounts of men out to that debris field, gathering up all sorts of stuff. The townsfolk all remember seeing these convoys going through and just these lines and lines of soldiers who were handling this sort of cleanup of whatever had occurred. And what they do is initially, when asked by the local newspaper what is going on, oddly enough, the town of Roswell actually had 2 newspapers, which is funny for us today, because most even major cities might not even have one. But 2 newspapers. He talked to one of the newspaper men, and the military is quoted as saying, "We captured a flying saucer." And that headline gets printed on July 8th, 1947, that next day, by the local Roswell newspaper. And it just blows up. It goes worldwide. It goes as viral as something can go in 1947. And everybody's talking about this. The larger context of this, of course, is put against some sort of historical backdrop, which we can talk about later. But the whole idea of it is like, this is insane. Then, as the cleanup is happening, the military takes a step back that next day with the other local newspaper and says, it was just, we're like, JK, we're kidding, that was a weather balloon out there in the field. And so then that headline goes out and says that no, that we debunked it, don't worry about it, it's not a flying saucer, it's a weather balloon. And that seems to quell a lot of interest in the case for a long time.
Sometime on July 4th weekend, 1947, New Mexico rancher William W. Brazel, known to his friends as Mac, heard an explosion during a thunderstorm above his property. In the days following, he found an unidentified flying object, a flying saucer, likely of extraterrestrial origin, whose knowledge to the public was so dangerous that it triggered one of the biggest military cover-ups in the history of the United States.
What has become known as the Roswell UFO incident is a difficult-to-navigate web of testimony and news reports, books published decades after the fact, pop culture, and urban legend that's been spread unfettered like a really bad game of telephone. The actual events of what actually occurred in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 is really hard to pin down, but we're going to do our best. There certainly is something at stake here. What landed in the field 74 years ago could just be another mundane weather balloon, but it might be the first contact with life on other worlds.
Hi, I'm Dan.
And I'm Jake, and we're both public high school teachers. Roswell, New Mexico was already kind of an interesting place before the UFO incident. It served as a POW camp during World War II for German prisoners, and it was chosen because it is smack dab in the middle of Nowheresville, USA. It's 3 hours to Albuquerque, it's 3 hours to Lubbock, and it's 3 hours to Las Cruces. It's remote, to say the least. The town is surrounded on every side for hundreds and hundreds of miles of high plains and empty desert. Even though Roswell was a small town in the 40s and has fewer than 50,000 residents today, it's home to what was known as the Roswell Army Airfield, and it's where the Enola Gay, the plane that was used to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was stationed after World War II. This is the airfield where they took off.
Following the war, Roswell was the home of the 509th Composite Group, a unit in the Army for the deployment of atomic bombs. It's also not that far from the White Sands testing ground in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I think it's probably important to note that an area famous for a UFO crash did have verifiable nuclear experimentation and military technology very close by. Let's go to what allegedly happened in July of 1947.
On Tuesday, July 1st, 3 different groups of military observers clocked a strange object whose speed and movements indicate that it couldn't have been any existing terrestrial technology. Checking radar equipment didn't show any sign of malfunction.
On Wednesday, July 2nd, Roswell business owner Dan Wilmot and his wife were sitting on their porch when they saw what they described as a luminous, oval-shaped object streaking across the sky northeast toward Corona, New Mexico. They estimated it going 400 to 500 miles an hour, which is about the speed of a modern commercial aircraft.
Thursday, July 3rd, a radar expert at the White Sands testing ground named Frank Kaufman tracked this mysterious object as it flashed through the atmosphere. The radar screen lit up, he said, and watched the tracking screens for nearly 24 hours. That night, Mac Brazel heard a thunderous explosion, but not exactly thunder, during a storm on his ranch.
On the morning of July 4th, Mac went out to check on his flock. According to Brazel, he found a large area of bright wreckage made up of rubber strips, tinfoil, and rather tough paper and sticks. He brought it to his nearest neighbors, Floyd and Loretta Proctor, who never forgot what he brought them that day. Loretta Proctor described the strange collection of objects in detail.
She said, "What he brought up and showed us was like a lightweight wood. It was 6 or 7 inches long and was a little bigger around than a pencil. He and my husband, they tried to cut on it and they tried to burn it, and it didn't make a mark or anything. It was different from anything we had ever seen. He described an aluminum-type material that looked like foil, and when you'd crush it up, it'd just straighten back out. It wouldn't wrinkle. He described some kind of tape, and there was some part of it that had some purplish pink figures on it. He said it wasn't Japanese or any writing that he knew anything about."
On either July 6th or 7th, Mac drove the wreckage to Roswell, which was pretty much a full day's drive across desert dirt roads. He brought his find to Sheriff George Wilcox, who recommended that they notify the Army at the nearby airfield. Intelligence Officer Major Jesse Marcel, along with 2 other officers, were dispatched to Brazel's ranch and inspected the debris. They gathered up some or all of it and took what they could back to Roswell with them. None of the men knew what they were looking at, and the higher-ups in the chain of command were soon notified.
On July 8th, the Army issued a press release about what they had found. Walter Hott, the information officer for the 509th Bomb Group, was told that they had a flying saucer in their possession, and Colonel William Blanchard told him as little information as humanly possible with which to write a press release. What Walter wrote said that the Army had recovered a flying disc which had landed on a ranch near Roswell. The story was picked up by the local paper, the Roswell Daily Record, stating RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell. The story caught fire and even ran in syndication in newspapers across the country. What was it? A Soviet aircraft? A holdover Nazi creation? Something else?
The day after, on July 9th, the original press release was retracted, and General Roger M. Ramey held a press conference about what they found. It was just an ordinary weather balloon, he said. Ramey demonstrated the use of a high-altitude weather balloon, pictured here, to the press. And the story died the next day. I mean, why wouldn't it? We had just won World War II. Trust in the Army was at an all-time high. So you might be asking yourself, how did the world just accept that the first flying saucer ever found wasn't even a flying saucer, that it was just a boring old weather balloon, and move on? How did we forget about it? Well, we're of the opinion that what Mac actually found on his ranch on June 14th, June 14th? June 14th? I thought he said he found it on the weekend of July 4th.
Okay, and there's some other stuff here too about Mac maybe being escorted to the Roswell Daily Record by strange men in black, and he might have changed his story out of coercion from the Army. There's maybe the bodies of 2 or 3 aliens found out in the desert. Maybe one of them survived and lived for a few more decades at Area 51. And there's a couple of death threats here about people never talking about what they saw, and what is that grinning man? And I guess it's technically possible that this is where we get Velcro and microwaves from.
There are a few years in ufology, which is the study of UFOs, that are really important, and 1947 is one of them. Some of the other ones are in the late 1960s. There's 1897. Some various important dates happen.
Flat days, right?
Flat dates, supposedly. That's into more theoretical stuff for another video. But their 1947 is essential to remember that. That was the report. That was the year that Kenneth Arnold made his report. Kenneth Arnold was, in a sense, the first person to really say that he saw a UFO. He was a commercial sort of like businessman who was a pilot on the side, was flying near Mount Rainier, and it was just a couple of months, I believe, before the Roswell thing happened. In 1947, said that he saw these 9 craft around his plane, and actually described them to a newspaper reporter as looking like flying saucers. And he sort of inadvertently coined the term. That craze set off all sorts of things because suddenly there were strange things in the sky. And people were interested in this alleged report for 2 reasons. Number one, because it's weird and it's fun to think about these things. But back in those days, maybe not necessarily so much, because we're coming fresh out of World War II. And the idea that there are foreign agents in the sky flying things over your country that you don't know what they are is admittedly very scary. And so that sort of starts this 1947 UFO craze. Different sightings are happening. People are seeing things. There is, looking at sort of the historical context of that year, a very high number of reports in the year of 1947. And so Roswell, I think, is essential because it's the first time, and this is in July of 1947, it's the first time that the UFO phenomena starts to feel real and tangible. Because you're coming out of World War II. Trust and faith in the government and the military is very high. These guys legitimately just saved the world. And suddenly the Air Force is saying, we just captured a flying saucer. It seems like something is very real, is happening there. So I think that's why it's so infamous and why it sort of fell into the history books in that way, because it was global and the name is catchy. And it was the first time that people were like, whoa, finally, yeah, heck yeah, there's things in the sky. All these people aren't crazy, something's there.
Do you feel like there's a difference between how ufologists or paranormal investigators such as yourself understand Roswell and the average hobbyist, or like a person who's just kind of familiar with it from like a pop culture sense?
Mm-hmm. I think that in a lot of ways, Roswell is, for lack of a better term, Roswell is the gateway drug. It starts out innocently enough. You're sitting there and you're interested in this, like, oh yeah, Roswell. I mean, let's watch a little History Channel program about that, and then suddenly it sparks an interest in some people, and they start diving further and further, and then before you know it, Roswell opens up the whole world of aliens and UFOs to the casual viewer, in a sense. Because it's so infamous, everybody gets it. Something crashed in the desert. It has that American West appeal that a lot of people out there, out east, are sort of like searching for that cowboy yearning feeling too. It hits so many markers for just a prime front page story. And so, anyway, I think that it's different because when people initially start looking into it, they're like, oh yeah, Roswell, because it seems easy enough to understand. And before you know it, you're reading about George Adamski and Van Tassel and UFO cults of the 1970s, and then diving further and further into this. So it's what I would call the greatest hits. It's the one-hit wonder of the UFO world, where people who are really into it recognize that the general public doesn't know the full discography, but it's the first song that people hear about.
As much as we agree with Fox Mulder's I Want to Believe poster, Roswell tends to fall apart pretty quickly. The story already becomes a little shaky with just Mac Brazel, because according to some accounts, he actually found the debris way back on June 14th when driving across the ranch with his son Vernon in their truck. Now, the Proctors seem to corroborate this version of the story because Loretta Proctor is quoted as having said that Mac brought it to them before the weekend of July 4th. Mac might have even gone out multiple weekends in a row to gather up what he could find of the debris.
Also, a lot of the information that formed the edges of this story, the testing grounds picking up strange signals, the people at Roswell seeing unexplainable lights, are all just testimony collected from people in their 70s and 80s, sometimes 5 decades after the actual event. We couldn't verify pretty much any of it. Seriously, a lot of these stories we could only find on the website of the Albuquerque Journal. It doesn't look like that site's been updated since 1997. Links to every account we use are down in the description.
This passage on the Roswell incident's Wikipedia page really got me. Though hundreds of people were interviewed by various researchers, only a few of these people claimed to have seen debris or aliens. Most witnesses were just repeating the claims of others. Of the 300 plus individuals reportedly interviewed for UFO crash at Roswell, only 41 can be considered genuine first or second-hand witnesses, and only 23 can be reasonably thought to have seen physical evidence or debris. Of these, only 7 have asserted anything suggestive of otherworldly origins for the debris. So, do these accounts hold up to any kind of journalistic integrity? Not really, no.
Here's what we can even more confidently debunk. Claims of bodies found amongst wreckage feel almost incredibly apocryphal. Most claims of finding any kind of alien bodies don't surface until decades after 1947, and even then, they're really thin. Additionally, reports of where alien bodies were found are spread over a 600-mile area, which would indicate multiple crashes, I guess. A lot of those sites are almost laughably far from Roswell or Corona, New Mexico.
When it comes to accounts of bodies, the best-known story comes from Glenn Dennis, who is a mortician at Roswell's Ballard Funeral Home. Glenn claims that he received phone calls from the airfield asking if he had any hermetically sealed children's coffins. He didn't, by the way, but he said he could have them from Amarillo by morning, and they said, no, that's okay. They also asked if he had any tips for preserving bodies that had been out in the elements for a couple of days. He also says that a nurse friend of his at the airfield hospital drew on a prescription pad for him depictions of what we would commonly call gray aliens today, who are kind of like the cosmic bad guys of ufology.
Unfortunately, Glenn's story doesn't exactly hold up, especially the part about the nurse. Nobody has ever been able to find his nurse friend, and when confronted with the idea that she never existed, he's even changed what her name was. And that alien autopsy we showed you in the intro, totally fake.
I don't want to give the impression that this case is entirely open and shut for us, though. It's not like it's totally boring, and we don't feel like we have all the answers either. There are a couple of things that we've read or seen that are just kind of weird and we can't explain them. Most of those come from our own trip to Roswell in 2015 that we took with some friends, including Connor. We got a tour from a guy named Dennis Balthaser, who drove us to various Roswell locations, including the airfield, and told us stories about people who he personally knew who were involved in the UFO incident.
One stop included Major Jesse Marcel's old house. According to Dennis, Jesse Marcel's kids saw the Roswell wreckage when he brought it home, and his son Jesse Jr. got to see it. He said that he was told by his father to never, ever speak of what he saw in that box, and his son kept that promise until his father's death. Today, he's a small part of the ufology community.
Dennis also told us a strange fact about Walter Haut, the information officer who originally put the press release out about the flying saucer. Apparently, he received a Christmas card from Colonel Blanchard every year for the rest of his life without ever missing a holiday. We didn't really know what to make of that, but Dennis Balthaser thinks that that was a subtle threat from the colonel, saying, I know where you live, I know you're still alive, so that he would be too afraid to ever spill the beans.
The last tidbit Dennis imparted to us was the most menacing. There's been much speculation about the photos of the Roswell debris and when they were taken, and what they're photos of, and whether or not they're staged. According to Dennis, they aren't what Mac found in his field. He claims that Marcel looked at the box of ordinary weather balloon parts presented in General Ramey and said, "Those aren't what we found. Where did those go?" To which Ramey responded, "You pose for the pictures, I'll ask the questions."
Apparently, what crashed in the field in Roswell was a large-scale device that was part of something called Project Mogul. Project Mogul was something that they were never going to tell people about way back when, because it was incredibly top secret.
This is the high altitude balloons for radioactivity. Right?
And it's this device. They actually released some pictures of sort of what it looked like, so you can find those online as well, of this sort of string of different things that went way up into sort of the stratosphere, and they were listening for seismic activity to see if the Soviets were also going to launch an atomic bomb. And that's the sort of thing that you will never hear about. in the moment, right? While we're at the threat of being bombed by the Soviets. And so they come forward and say, actually, what crashed was this. It wasn't a weather balloon. It wasn't this. That answer has to be met with certain questions as well. Number one, you have to be a little bit appreciative of a potential real answer from the government. But number two, you have to sit back and be like, hold on. If we accept this, we also have to accept the fact that the military lies to us knowingly, right? So once a friend lies to you once, why would you ever think, well, they're never going to do that to me again, right? That sort of could continuously keep occurring. And so they made up a story once. Why not make up a story twice, of course, is the counter argument. But I will admit that when you look at things like the U-2 spy plane that they didn't tell people about, and that was, out there in the deserts of Nevada, up north as well, and came forward and say, no, this is it. I don't think it's ridiculous to think that the military is ahead of us technology-wise up in the sky. But I don't think that they know what is going on with aliens and UFOs. And there's either two answers. Either they, and I heard this from John Tenney, either they don't know what's going on and they don't want us to know, or they know what's going on and they don't want us to know.
What probably actually happened at Roswell is pretty well documented at this point. Project Mogul was a secret army program using high-altitude weather balloons and microphones to record seismic activity. Basically, they were looking for Soviet atomic bomb tests. What Mac found on his ranch is just much more likely to be debris from Project Mogul and one of its balloons. The description of parts from Project Mogul even line up pretty well with the debris people describe in the Roswell incident. To the untrained eye, the reflectors looked extremely odd, a geometrical hash of lightweight sticks and sharp angles made of metal foil. Photographs of it, taken in 1947 and published in newspapers, show bits and pieces of what are obviously collapsed balloons and radar reflectors.
That even seems to explain the nature of the cover-up. You don't want to expose the technology to the enemy, and you don't want to alarm the public about the enemy possibly having an A-bomb. In our minds, it's just so much more likely that the wreckage at the center of this story is from Project Mogul, not from outer space. And after you've examined all the evidence, I think what Roswell comes down to is how credible each witness account seems to you. What makes you want to dive into them more, and who seems to hint at something we just haven't yet discovered.
With any kind of physical evidence gone from an event like this from the past, all we really have is stories. And when you try to figure out what happened, what you're doing is piecing together a narrative. So construct with a critical eye, while trying to not lose that sense of wonder and curiosity that brought you to it in the first place. Maybe the most important part of I want to believe isn't the believe, but maybe the want, that spark that sends you to want to know more and learn more about a subject. So what draws you to the Roswell story? Is there anything we didn't talk about that you feel like shifts the tides in favor of the Army's story or of aliens? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to do some of your own research, all of our sources are down there as well.
Now, outside of Roswell, do we think aliens are real? Maybe. Considering the size of the universe, it seems like a given that there's some life somewhere, be it intelligent or not. It seems a bit arrogant to dismiss that kind of thing out of hand, which is why we didn't completely dismiss all of the Roswell story. So there's probably life out there. We probably have to wait around a little bit longer to find it, though. Those aren't what we found. Where did those go?